So our exhortation is titled Binding the Strong Man.
Good morning, everyone. I chose this topic partly because there is kind of a daily readings class that's online. Some of you may have heard of it with Doug Finley. And actually, there's a brother named Northcott on that a couple here might be familiar with. But anyway, during those readings, sometimes things come up and you think about them, say, well, that's kind of interesting, or somebody makes a comment, and you think, I'm not sure about that, and so you maybe look into it a little bit further and find out, well, perhaps you have a different view, or that view is, right on, spot on. So I think it's always kind of interesting in that sense, actually, to get other perspectives on it. So what I was going to talk about this morning is one of the things that was brought up in Sunday school, I think I saw on YouTube, Sharon brought it up about Zacchaeus. And everybody knows the story about Zacchaeus, I think. So I'm not going to get into it that much. But we know that he was a chief tax collector from Luke chapter 19. And one of the reasons I read historically that he got so rich was there was a balsam trade that was out of, interestingly, En-Gedi. So if you've been to that area, you realize that's kind of the only place in the middle of the desert, it's like in an oasis, that things grow. And particularly that particular tree that grew there, it was unique. And apparently it doesn't grow there anymore, but they got this balm paste out of it. And you can even kind of remember a little bit about Joseph. There were traders that were going that had balm. But anyway, there was what they called the King's Highway that I think went from what today would be Saudi Arabia up north to Damascus. It's always been there for centuries. And it more than likely had to run through Jericho. So the historians think that more than likely that's where he got a lot of his tax money through that particular trade. And it makes sense because it sounds like even the Romans later were very interested in that balm. So it was like exported throughout the world. Anyway, one of the interesting things about that, so that was mentioned in Luke 19, but if you go to Luke, actually Matthew 18, I think we're all familiar with this, but it says in verse 17, if they refuse to listen to even to the church, in Matthew 18, I think a lot of us are familiar with that particular passage about how to deal with discipline in the church. He said, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. And we know that was, basically starting from scratch, but tax collectors were, apparently seen as at the level of a pagan at some point. And part of the reason for that is they were viewed as being corrupt people. And interestingly, historians said that they would not use tax collectors as a witness in a document. So for example, if you were, doing a will, they couldn't be a witness because they were seen as corrupt. And that may have been in the Jewish tradition, that they couldn't be a witness, but that's kind of where they were on the totem pole for legal matters. So to me, kind of the interesting thing here is he was seen as kind of a person that could not be a witness in a legal matter, yet at the same time, he was witnessing for Jesus. We know in Luke 18, remember the Pharisee that stood up and prayed to God, he said, I thank you that I'm not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector that he spoke of. So again, here we see someone who can't be a witness in a legal matter, but Jesus is kind of flipping the tables here and saying, we all talk about Zacchaeus, don't we? But he's a legal witness to Jesus. So why is he a witness for the gospel, let's say? Well, one thing we know for sure is he shared his wealth. And in the previous chapter, in Luke 18, it talked about the rich young ruler who could not give his wealth away, right? He didn't want to disperse it. So we know as we read about Zacchaeus that he is a person that is joyful to receive Jesus as a guest in his house. So therefore, right away, it's kind of an exhortation right there that not only was he sharing things, but he was joyful to relieve Jesus in his house. And, that flashes back to Joshua 24:2, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So if we jump to what was read this morning in Mark 3:27, the scribes and Pharisees are saying, Jesus, you're possessed by Beelzebub. Right? You've got Beelzebub on your mind. And apparently what had happened, this was kind of a pagan belief that had crept into the Jewish society. And, it's still in today about people believe that. Some people do, not all people. But interestingly, Jesus didn't condemn that practice as apostate right in front of their faces. So does the fact that he didn't condemn it mean that it didn't exist? No, I think in a roundabout way, Jesus was able to dismantle their belief. Because we know that he says, how can it be that Satan casts out Satan? Out to anybody rational, that's impossible. And I was thinking as an example, in Mesopotamia, they had a god called Nergal, and he was the god of plagues and pestilences. And so if you had somebody like Jesus in warfare who stopped all of that, and they called him Nergal, the chief of the pestilence, and he stopped it, how could that possibly be the case? And then Jesus goes on to say, if a house is divided against itself, that house cannot stand. And I think in this particular case, he's talking about Israel. It's divided. And so he's, I think, by dismantling them, saying, I'm much greater than this Beelzebub. How can you even believe in that? I don't care what the deal is. I'm greater than he is, period. So Jesus then goes on, as Dan read this morning, about the strong man being bound. And then the house is plundered. So Jesus is talking about plundering the strong man's house. Well, the strong man is sin. And my question was, well, what does the strong man have that needs to be plundered? That seemed a little strange. And I have an idea on that. You might have your own, so you can take mine with a grain of salt if you want, and I'll get to that. And kind of switching gears a little bit here, we know that as Jesus began to grow, that he did increase in knowledge. And it says, and Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. That's in Luke 2:52. So I think the Bible stories that are out there, especially in the Old Testament, were written for him. And again, I think I've said this before, when we're baptized in his name, they become written for us then. So we become beneficiaries of something I think was originally written for Jesus. And one of those things, and I think there's all kinds of stories in the Old Testament that are written that way. And they're beautiful stories, and they're great stories to teach our kids. And, I think as we get older, the stories become a little bit more poignant and more understanding in the sense that they're relevant to our lives. But one of the stories I'm going to focus on and not get into it deeply is Samson, because I think we all know about Samson and from the book of Judges. And the reason I'm going to bring that particular episode up is Samson and Jesus were both bound by their brethren. In the case of Jesus, Matthew 27:1 says, and when morning came, all the chief priests and elders of the people conspired against Jesus to put him to death. They bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate, the governor. So they bound him up, his own people did, gave him to Pilate. Pilate's a Gentile, right? Handed him over. Now, in the case of Samson, in the book of Judges, chapter 15, tells us that Samson destroyed the fields of the Philistines. And I don't know if anybody, young people, can tell me how that happened. It had something to do with foxes. So does anybody know how he destroyed those fields? Sharon, you look like you're nodding. I know you're not. Yeah, he put their tails together and burned them down. So he did that because they took away his wife. And his brethren, the Jewish brethren, response to that destruction that happened, so 3,000 men of Judah went to the cave of the rock of Elam, and they asked Samson, "Do you not realize the Philistines rule over us? What have you done to us?" He said, Samson said, I did to them what they did to me. And he replied, but they said to him, we have come down, his brethren are saying, we've come down to arrest you, hand you over to the Philistines. And Samson replied, swear to me that you will not kill me yourselves. And they answered, no, we will not kill you, but we will tie you up securely and hand you over to them. So they bound him with 2 new ropes and led him up from the rock. So my question, would any of that sound familiar to Jesus coming in his time? I think this story was probably pretty relevant to him and pretty powerful, because I think he knew for certain he was going to relive that story in a different way. So his brethren hand them over to the Gentiles, saying, we're not going to kill you, but we're going to hand you over to them. So in the case of Samson, well, what happens to him when he's handed over? Well, the Lord orchestrates a great deliverance through Samson. So he's bound by his brethren, handed over to the Philistines. Jesus was bound by his brethren and handed over to Pilate. And after this, Samson thirsted after such a great deliverance. And does anybody know what that deliverance was? Can they think about that was? It's related to the jawbone of an ass or donkey. Well, I think we all pretty much know that that's what happened. He killed them. Also, Jesus says in John 19, verses 28 and 29, after his great deliverance in dying, that he thirsted. So, our old man's nature that we have, that's the flesh, prevents us from becoming completely righteous. We can't with the flesh. And by plundering the strong man's house, which is sin, Jesus takes away that horrible stumbling block. In doing so, our natures will change at the resurrection. We don't deserve it. We don't do anything to deserve it, because we know the wages of sin are death. Jesus wants to share his gift that he received for being perfect with his brethren. So he wants to share that gift. Something like Zacchaeus. He has that great gift. He wants to share it. And interestingly, too, Jesus, in the case of Zacchaeus, says he's the son of Abraham. He tells him that. Well, he already was a son of Abraham by birth. He was a Jew. So why is Jesus saying that? I think because he is now a spiritual son of Abraham through his belief in Jesus, through him accepting him in his house. Again, the rich man doesn't want to share or distribute his goods, nor does the strong man want to share. And the law of Moses represented that strong man in a way. So how, you say, did the law of Moses represent that strong man? Well, in Matthew 5:17, Jesus says, do not think I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. So Jesus isn't saying the law was bad. So why had it become the strong man? So I kind of see, if you're traveling on a highway and you see signs that lead to New York or Chicago, when you finally get there, you follow all of that sign, you're there. And I think that's exactly what Jesus is saying when he's saying, I fulfilled it. I'm here. I am the fulfillment of that law. So why did the strong man equate to the law? Well, I think Jesus explains it in Matthew 23, verses 1 through, 10. Jesus said to his disciples, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on the seat of Moses. So they sit on Moses' seat. That's what they do. So he says to them, practice and observe whatever they tell you, but not what they do. For they preach, but do not practice. And he goes on to say, they bind heavy burdens. That's what they do. So you can see there's kind of an equation to that, the law, the way they do it. And he goes on to explain it even further. Heavy burdens hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with their finger. They do all their deeds to be seen by men, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. So it's show, a lot of show. And they love the place of honor at feasts, and the best seats in the synagogues. And they like the salutations in the marketplaces, and being called rabbi by men. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brethren. Well, no one could be righteous under the law the way the Pharisees had made it, Sadducees. We know the law condemned the flesh that told you were sinning, but they took it to another level as what they had done. And Paul kind of confirms that also. Acts 10, Paul says, brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved. I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but it is not enlightened. So he's talking about the scribes and Pharisees. Paul is saying this right now. In verse 3 he says, for being ignorant of the righteousness that comes from God and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. So he's saying, hey, they built up their own righteousness around the law. They perverted the law. He goes on to say, Paul does in verse 4, for Christ is the end of the law, that everyone who has faith may be justified. So the Pharisees, when they were developing their own righteousness, in effect, stole the righteousness of God. So, how can that be? Well, I think they essentially set up roadblocks so that you couldn't see who Jesus was when he did come. So they became a stumbling block to the people. Like Ezekiel 44, when it talks about the prophets, they became stumbling blocks. So I think when Jesus starts talking about plundering the strong man's house, he's in a sense saying he's going to bring back the true righteousness that the law points to by getting rid of the righteousness, the self-made righteousness of the Pharisees and scribes. Because they had guarded, the Pharisees and scribes had guarded that fraudulent righteousness by imposing their own versions of it on the people. And so, as Dan was alluding to earlier, we know in real life, Jesus cured a strong man named Legion. So he cured the strong man. So he did that. And one of the things it says about that, and it says when he came out of the boat, there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit who lived among the tombs. No one could bind him anymore, even with a chain, for he had often been bound with fetters and chains. With the chains he wrenched apart, and the fetters he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and bruising himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and worshipped him. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." And I kind of wonder, why did he say that? And I think it was possibly because in his background, he knew what the Pharisees' version of righteousness was. And he thought that's what Jesus was going to provide to him. But, of course, we know that isn't what he provided. He provided true righteousness. Because Jesus said to him, to the unclean spirit, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he said, "My name is Legion." And he begged him eagerly not to send him out of the country. And we know then a great herd of swine was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, "Send us to the swine, let us enter them." So he gave them leave, and the unclean spirits came out, entered the swine. The herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. The herdsmen fled and told it in the city, and the people came to see what had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demoniac sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, the man who had the legion, and they were afraid. Just thinking, many times, one of the times I was thinking, there's other one, but when you think of Ananias and Sapphira, when that happened to them, the people were afraid. But actually, at that same time, just after that, the church increased in droves. So it's almost like you have to understand that God is in charge. And that's what happened here. They were afraid because they couldn't believe this guy was changed. So just on a little bit of an aside this time, I know some of you have been down to Branson, and you've been to the Sight and Sound Theater. And Sherry and I were there for a presentation of Samson. And we were trying to be kind of critical of what was going on. Is this all right? Because there was one scene that it seemed where they had a big embellishment of the scene where Samson said that he was very thirsty after he had killed all of the. So if you saw that one, you know what I'm talking about. And I thought, well, is that really there? Well, it isn't maybe as embellished much in the Bible. It just says that. But we went looking and said, yeah, he was thirsty after he had killed the 1,000 Philistines. In Judges 5:17, it says, when he had finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone out of his hand, and that place was called Ramoth Lehi. And he was very thirsty. And he called on the Lord and said, "Thou hast granted this great deliverance by the hand of thy servant. Shall I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" And God split open the hollow place that is at Lehi, and there came water from it. And when he drank, his spirit returned, and he revived. And Jesus also said in John 19:28, "I thirst." And John's rendition of that, starting in 28th verse of chapter 19. After this, Jesus, knowing that all was now finished, said, "I thirst." A bowl of vinegar stood there, so he put a sponge full of vinegar on hyssop and held it to his mouth. And when Jesus had received the vinegar, he said, "It is finished." Jesus was thirsty for salvation. That's what he was looking for. Samson had a physical thirst, but I think we can see how those could equate. Actually, I think I'd given a talk coming out of surgery one time, and they wouldn't give me any water. I mentioned that earlier. And, I know what it's like to be really thirsty in sporting events, too. So I think Jesus is accomplishing in prophecy what happened to Samson. In the Amplified Version in John 19, or actually, I'm sorry, in Psalm 22, it says, in verse 28, "For the kingship and the kingdom are the Lord's, and he is the ruler over the nations. All the mighty ones upon earth shall eat in thanksgiving and worship, and they shall go down to the dust and shall bow before him, even he who cannot keep himself alive. Posterity shall serve him. They shall tell the Lord to the next generation. They shall come and shall declare his righteousness to the people yet to be born, that he has done it, or that it is finished." So in essence, Psalm 22 is saying this is what the Messiah, it's messianic. So that's what Jesus did. It's finished. Jesus overcame and conquered his own sin in the flesh. And on the cross, Jesus literally bound the strong man when he was crucified. That was binding him. Our wages are death. We know the wages of sin are death. Jesus didn't deserve death. He didn't sin. Like his reward is king and high priest before his heavenly Father. And like Zacchaeus, Jesus wants to share his reward. even though we're not worthy of the reward. He wants to give us the reward. The strong man in our case is the flesh. It was in the case of the law that identified the flesh was weak. But the flesh keeps us from becoming righteous, totally righteous. Jesus tells us from the Sermon on the Mount, on one of the renditions in Matthew 5, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied." And I think that's why Jesus, what he was thirsting for. And we know that in 2 Timothy, Paul tells about the crown of righteousness. In the future there is reserved for me the victor's crown of righteousness, being right with God, doing the right thing, which God asked him to do, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award me on that great day, and not to me only, but also to those who have loved and longed for his welcomed appearing. So essentially, that's what Zacchaeus did. He joyfully brought him into his house. So here again is Zacchaeus sharing half of his riches, joyfully receiving Christ into his house. And so this morning when we come together, we're essentially sharing, aren't we, the bread and the wine. And we're instructed to keep that in the memory of our dear Lord. That the sacrifice that he made and the resurrection are leading to the establishment of the kingdom in Jerusalem. And I think that's what the prophet Isaiah says in chapter 53, which we again know as a messianic chapter in the Bible. And he says in verse 12 of 53, "Therefore I will divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong." Well, there's a lot of interpretations of that spoil with the strong. But one of those is, in Hebrew, those that are bound. So he's saying he shall divide the spoil with those that are bound, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors, yet he bore the sin of many, and he made intercession for the transgressors. So keep in mind that great sacrifice that he did for us, wanting to do it, wanting to share his plunder with his believers.